assume everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
And I'll start my timer because as I understand it, we've got 20 minutes to go through this session. So firstly, thank you, Catherine and Gavin. I am reasonably new to, let's say, getting involved more into in the data community when it comes to blogging, when it comes to talking about some of the areas that I'm working in. So it really is people like Catherine and Gavin that really giving us an opportunity to speak. So thank you to them. Now, yes, it has been brought to my attention that this title is quite long. I've got to squeeze all the words in there, but essentially we're looking at using the serverless SQL engine that's within Azure Synapse Analytics within Power BI Dataflows. So what we're going to be covering in the session, so there's a little bit about me. So the QR code will take you to my Twitter. So please connect with me. Let's carry on the conversation around this, because Serverless SQL and the rebranded Synapse Analytics, we've known about it for 18 months. It's still growing. The Serverless SQL part, limitless capability. So I do enjoy a conversation on there as well. And I do work predominantly with the Azure data platform. So we're going to be looking at, well, firstly, who is this session for? And that kind of feeds into the technology as well, because we are looking at two very different technologies. We've got a business intelligence and analytics tool, and we've got a big data and data warehouse tool on the other side. We're going to be looking at connecting Power BI and Synapse together, but ultimately having a little look at data flows. What are the serverless SQL pools? Why we'd want to use those together, and one of the concepts that is essentially the crux of why we'd want to use serverless SQL, which is query folding within Power BI. So really, you can see that we've got Synapse, and off Synapse we have the data warehouse developer and the data engineer. It could be a massive simplification in those roles, but predominantly that expertise is being used with Synapse, building data warehousing solutions, connecting to data lakes and curating that data from a data engineering perspective. And on the Power BI side, you've got the business intelligence developer, the analyst, and the data scientist as well, if they're going to use Python and R. However, Power BI already has a connector to the data lake. So if you use Power Query, if you use data flows, you can see that there's already a connector there to connect to the data lake, which works very well. It's out of the box. It's not a custom component. It's there. It can recursively load files in a folder structure. However, when the size of the data grows to a considerable amount in the data lake, that's that there's a good chance that's going to happen. And if there's any transformations within that data flow, within that Power Query, that starts to be expensive from a Power Query perspective, then perhaps it can be pushed down to serverless SQL if we're loading CSV data, Parquet data, or JSON data from the data lake. So with data flows, it's a Power Query based feature that's available in the Power BI service, where we're looking to load in and transform data from disparate sources and create a centralized repository of data that can be reused by Power BI data sets. So we're going to be cleansing and transforming that data once. We're going to be minimizing the connections to our data sources and making available transformed and cleansed data to be used by Power BI. On the serverless SQL side of things, it's a new engine that essentially connects to the data lake, and Azure storage, and uses SQL to read data from the data lake and also write data as well. You can write the results of a select statement back to storage. And you can use business intelligence tools such as Power BI. And you can see two SQL statements there at the bottom. On the left-hand side, we're connecting to a Parquet file format. Our data source has been defined, predefined, which is a connection to the data lake. And we can see a folder structure in our bulk statement there. On the right-hand side, we can see another select statement where we're using the file path function, which acts like a filter. So if there's anyone familiar with the Hive partition structure in a data lake where you can separate your data by year, month, day, hour, for example, and by selecting data, you can prune and remove any unwanted partitions when you're selecting your data. Now, we've got an endpoint that Power BI can connect to. So in the Azure Portal, you will see when you create the Synapse Analytics, you'll see a Serverless SQL endpoint that you can connect to, like any database. And what we can do is we can create an external table within Synapse Analytics. We can create a database, create an external table within that database to cast structure and point to data that's sat in the data lake. And what Power BI will do, it will see that external table as an object that it can connect to. It's important to note we've got three file formats currently supported. We have CSV or delimited data, Parquet, which is a compressed file format, and JSON, which is a file format to store sort of semi-structured data. And essentially what we're doing is we're letting SQL Serverless do the processing. And that last point, the query folding feature, that's the most important because we want to use the power of Serverless SQL and let the data flow push that transformation down. Now, with Synapse Analytics, there's a few services. And what I want to do, I really want to call out the fact that in this scenario, we can purely use Synapse Analytics as a processing engine. We don't need to create a dedicated SQL pool, i.e. what used to be known as the data warehouse. We don't need to provision Spark pools. We don't need to integrate Power BI workspaces. We can. We don't need to create any pipelines, any data factory artifacts. We can purely use an instance of Synapse Analytics for Serverless SQL purposes. We can connect using Power BI, using Azure Data Studio, SSMS. And this is another powerful thing, is that if there's a data analyst who's creating Power BI artifacts, data flows, it may be beneficial for them to actually query the data in the data lake using Serverless SQL first, and then start building out that data flow. So there's some flexibility there as well. Now, with query folding, essentially, we're looking to push that transformation down to the data source. A common transformation that I use in this scenario is a group by, because I'm aggregating data and therefore reducing the size of the data that's being loaded into Power BI, especially from a data lake. And the SQL generated will be issued to the Synapse Analytics Serverless SQL. We can actually see that in monitoring. Now, ordering the steps is important in this scenario, especially when we've got an aggregated step, a group by, to reduce the size of that data set before we pull it into Power BI. Legend has it that the query on the right hand side is still running, because what we're doing is we are doing some transformations before we do any group by. So as you can see on the left hand side, we've got as many of the foldable steps as possible. So that group by has reduced that data set, brought it into Power BI, and finally a split transformation has been used, which now can't be folded. Now, when we look at the objects that are supported, we've got tables, views, stored procedures and native SQL. Stored procedures and native SQL no longer folding down, but we can connect to external tables and views. I'm going to jump to a demo. So I'm going to talk you through the artifacts that are being created in the data lake. So we've got some CSV files in Azure storage and some Parquet files as well. So we're going to be showing you how to connect to CSV and Parquet with these external tables. Now, as you can see, we've got 3 files and they're totaling around 4.2 gig for the CSV and a reduced size for Parquet. It's exactly the same data. And we're going to connect to the workspace, the Synapse Analytics workspace. And if we go into our Develop tab, we're going to run through a series of SQL scripts. And this is all in the blog post that you can link to at the end of the session and pull the code down if you'd like to run this yourself. But we're going to create a database in the built-in ServerlessSQL pool. You can see here we've got master. We're going to create that database. And then we can use that database like any other SQL database. We're going to create a schema to store our objects in. So you can see now we've got access to our SQL Data Saturdays database. We create our schema. And finally, the credentials and the security mechanism that I'm using is Azure Active Directory. I'm going to pass through the credentials all the way through from Power BI to Synapse to the data lake. Now, we need to create a pointer for the storage. So we can create this concept of an external data source, which is going to point to the container in the data lake. And then that will allow us to connect to that location when we're running our create external table syntax. Now, as I said, we've got support for file formats. In the scope of this session, we've got Parquet and delimited text CSV. We're using Parser version 2.0, which at the moment is the fastest way of connecting Synapse Analytics to CSV. And we've got our field terminator, string delimiter, and the first row. We don't have that information with Parquet because it's all stored in the file itself. And now what we can do is we can create an external table because we're not bringing any data within Synapse Analytics Serverless itself, not in this engine. So you can see we've got our location and our data source and our file format where we're going to run the external table commands to create the Parquet and CSV external tables. I like to do both so that you can see that not only are we connecting to data in the CSV format, but we're also connecting to Parquet data as well. So as you can see, I've got my fact internet sales, CSV, and Parquet. So I'm going to run these 2 statements. Okay, and what I'd like to do is I'm going to skip forward a little bit because I'd like to show the select statements from the external tables that are being created. So I can issue some count stats, both on the Parquet and the CSV. And finally, we'll just do some top 5 as well, because when you're working with Power BI, it's going to be issuing top X statements while you're working with it. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause it there and I'm going to switch to the live part of the demo, which is connecting Power BI to this external table. So I'm going to switch to my Power Break workspace, normal pro workspace, not premium enabled at all. And I'm going to connect to that endpoint, that serverless SQL endpoint from the Synapse blade in Azure. And I'm going to connect to my database. I created a new database earlier and ran the same scripts. And you can see that our external tables are visible to Power BI as if they were regular SQL database tables. So I'm going to connect to the CSV and click Transform Data. Okay, now I'm going to flick back to Synapse very quickly. We're going to go to the Monitor area and click on SQL Requests, because this is a very important screen in terms of working with Serverless SQL, because we can see the SQL statements that are being issued, so we can actually see, well, what statements is Power BI issuing down to the engine itself. Also, the most important thing is the data processed, because this is how you're being charged for the service. So with Serverless SQL, you're not charged for any level of compute. You're not charged for the amount of time that a query is running. You're being charged for how much data is being processed, i.e. read and written. So I'm going to go back. Okay, and now I start to build up my Power Query transformation. So I can add, let's say, a group by, which again is a common transformation for me working with Power BI where data is stored in the data lake. So I'm going to add some aggregations. So I'll say I want to group by product key, order date key, customer key, and the currency key. And I will do total row counts. We're going to count the rows, and we'll do total sales amount, and we'll do that as a sum of the sales amount column. We hit OK. While it's evaluating that, let's flick back to Synapse Analytics and refresh. We can see in our request, actually, if I go back and just click on more, I get a bit more of a structured SQL statement. I like this better. So as you can see, we're selecting a top because Power BI issues top statements. We can see we've got our columns used in our aggregation. We've got our aggregations itself and our group by statements. So we know that Power BI is pushing that transformation down to SQL Serverless. We go back to Power BI. We can now see we've got our data back, our aggregated data. The last thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to break the query folding. So let's split the columns. So let's say we're going to split by a number of characters, and we'll split by 1 character, just as a test. And as we can see, when it returns, we're going to have a step indicator that's going to tell me it can't fold the query down. Okay. Now, it hasn't broken the whole query. What it has done is it will send that group by down to Serverless SQL and then complete the rest of the steps. So if you're building out a transformation and you're using Serverless SQL, then reorder your transformations in the appropriate way to maximize what Serverless SQL is going to do, to crunch that data, to aggregate that data before returning back to Power BI. So I'm going to save and close. My queries will validate. I can save that data flow and refresh it. Okay, I'll click refresh, but I'll go back to the slides. Now, I did just see a question pop up very quickly, which was around the concept of the tables. yes, essentially, when you're creating these tables, you're casting structure over the data that's sat in the data lake. You're not pulling that data in itself. It's still stored in the data lake. It's just now you can query the table, and you create a view as well to query that data as if it were a regular SQL object. Now, on the cost side, yes, the cost is based on data processed. So at the moment, I get two different pricing dependent on if I'm logged into my account. But it's around £3 or £4 per 1 terabyte of data processed. So if you issue one query, it hits the data lake and it crunches 1 terabyte of data and returns a small result set to Power BI, you'll get charged that amount. On the infrastructure side, it is another service. So you are introducing another service to manage and maintain and implement security around that as well. But you do get a very powerful processing engine for file data that's sat in the data lake. So the last one is, this is the blog post. The QR code, if you scan, will take you to the blog post. There's the SQL scripts you can download. You can work through it. Connect with me on Twitter. There's lots to go on this. And yes, I'd like to continue the conversation on Twitter if possible. And that's it. So I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's been useful. And yeah, there we go. Back to you, Gavin.
Oh, okay. So that literally was 20 minutes.
There we go. I've got my timer in front of me. I've been told off in the past, Gavin.
Oh, okay. Not by us, I'm sure.
No.
Good. So there was a couple of other questions. So, so Martin asked, will there be support for the Delta Lake file format?
I hope so. I really, really do hope so. And again, this is what I say about conversations on Twitter is there's lots of back and forth around this. And when Databricks created the Delta format and open sourced it, it's really the responsibility of the software that wants to use the Delta Lake to implement the system to read that checkpointing and read the data in a consistent state. So I do hope serverless will support it in future, because there are some deficiencies in terms of being able to update and insert data. But yeah, so not yet, but fingers crossed.
Okay. And then Rishi, I'm not sure if it's a question or more of a statement, but he said it seems strange that query forwarding isn't available with a Dataflow connector in PBI by default, even on Premium, which has a DQ option for data flows. Is this layer expected to not be required in the future?
So that's when you're connecting from, let's say, data flows using Azure Data Lake connector.
Perhaps. So there was, so I'm not sure if Rishi was responding to perhaps Rishi might want to come off mute and just ask the question.
Yeah.
Hey, Gavin.
Some additional context. Hey, Rishi.
How you doing? Yeah, so it was just so if you're connecting to a data, so if you're creating the CSV files in the first place using a Power BI Dataflow and using the write back to Data Lake Gen2, so then you have, each time you refresh the data flow, it writes back that snapshot, that outputs of that refresh as CSV files in Data Lake Gen2. So you've linked it together. And then if you're connecting to that data flow now that sits there, so the files are in Data Lake Gen2 and you're connecting in Power BI. So if it sits on Premium, you can enable the enhanced compute engine, which is essentially, I thought was essentially a SQL Server engine, serverless engine.
Yeah, it's using column store as I understand it. But remember,
Right.
this is about connecting to the source data itself, because so that data flow will be writing that data out to to ADLS2 in that format. But the actual refreshing itself is if let's say you've got a folder structure in your data lake that new data is being added to, and then you're running a Power BI Dataflow refresh. It's going to reconnect via Serverless SQL to pull all that new data in, and then store it where it stores in Power BI.
Yeah. So this use case is more for when you've got a data flow reading from CSV files essentially.
Yes, or Parquet, or JSON. But so if you and it's all dependent on the data strategy within an organization, but predominantly data that's coming into a data lake, some of that will be ingested into a data warehouse. It will go through very controlled and tight ETL procedures. Other data that's coming in may want to be available, as soon as possible with as little overhead as possible. So connecting Power BI to that data lake natively may cause some issues if all of a sudden that data is growing in that data lake. And I did also see someone asking the question about Data Factory. Well, why don't you just use Data Factory to crunch that data and put it into a format that Power BI can then pull in? Well, yes. I mean, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but essentially you are introducing an engine that can query data in a data lake. With Data Factory, you're going to be building some predefined flows, whereas here, if you cast structure over the data in the data lake, the analyst or BI developer can sit there, maybe query that data to see, well, what do I need to bring in, and then start building that data flow.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I think it's a slightly different use case I'm thinking of when the data flow is writing back to CSV. So the source of the data flow might be anything, a SQL Server database, or it might be
So it's
and then it writes back the files to then you write back the files to CSV, and then you could query that using the Power BI connector as your Data Lake Gen2, or you could query it using the Dataflow connector. Either way, it would pick up the data.
Oh, it would. You need to get that data in there first.
Against that, but you can't query fold against that. That's the strange thing. Even on premium, you can't query fold against it, even though it seems like there is a SQL engine behind the scenes on it. But it seems like you need this layer in between to be able to essentially convert it with the SQL layer to be able to query fold against it.
Yeah, and in this particular scenario, Serverless SQL is being used to do the heavy lifting. Yeah, because if on a daily basis, if you were crunching 100 gig of data, or possibly a terabyte of data, dependent, and that's essentially going into Power BI, you're massively reducing that data. Then for this particular scenario, that's what you're doing in your data flow. The result of that data flow, is being stored, in CSV format, etc. Direct query mode, yes, it is available. And again, conversations I have on Twitter is around sometimes how chatty Power BI can be with data sources. So with Serverless SQL, if you have a report, it's connected in direct query. Let's say you've built it in Power BI desktop, which also you can just connect to Serverless SQL through desktop. Absolutely fine. Upload that to the service and refresh. Yes, you can use it in direct query, and it'll issue queries down to Serverless SQL and get back what you need.
So do you see kind of more organizations, Andy, moving more towards storing the data in that raw format, whether that be kind of Parquet or CSV, because it's cheaper to store it in that, and then layering tools like this over the top?
Augmentation, I think. And and I can go back to maybe 3 years ago, where there was a particular project where, you know, there's a data warehouse, facts and dimensions, very, you know, tightly controlled, ETL to load that warehouse, cleanse. But on the side, there was an awful lot of telemetry data coming in as well. Now, I have another session I'm going through at the moment, which is, you know, the dimensional model, the star schema with serverless SQL, because you've got all this data coming in. You still need to provide some form of context to it in the form of dimensions. So you can still keep all your telemetry, you can still transform it and cleanse it and store it in the data lake, insert into folder, you know, a folder structure, you know, a simple Hive folder structure of year, month, day, hour, for example. Append that data as it comes in. You don't have to load all of that data into a data warehouse. You can maybe pre-aggregate some of that data in the data warehouse, but you're augmenting, so you can still connect Power BI or a data warehouse and load that data in from the data lake. So will companies be building solutions entirely in serverless SQL? At the moment, there's a few things that you need to work around. The write back facility isn't very nuanced at the moment. You could use it, but I see it very much as a complementary technology to a data warehouse, in that now you can use your SQL skills, okay, to query data that's in a data lake, because, you know, the data engineering and data warehousing roles, you know, predominantly on the data engineering side, when you're working with big data, you see a lot of Spark, a lot of Python, a lot of Scala. And in fact, one of the points that I make in the dimensional modeling session is that you can bring your SQL skills, you can bring your, you know, all of that knowledge of SQL over the years into this process. So yeah, I see companies using it to load in telemetry data that's hitting a data lake, to pre-aggregate and pull that in, and to analyze it as well, without having to, you know, necessarily have, you know, expertise in Python or Scala.
No, that makes a lot of sense. There was another question that came in from Carlos. So, do you see any reason to include AAS between serverless and data flows?
AS.
AAS, so Azure
analysis
services.
Analysis Services.
Yeah.
Well, again, if this, I know there's a lot of talk of the move away from AAS into Power BI now that we've got, you know, premium Gen2 coming along. Now you can connect AAS to serverless. So if you did have data from a data warehouse and you were using dimensions, you could pull that data in to AAS and you could load in from the data lake using serverless SQL. So yeah, you know, I don't see any reason why you couldn't do it from a technical perspective. It just would depend on your, you know, on the organization's particular data strategy, whether AAS is, you know, at the forefront of the analytical data store.
Makes sense as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I think another statement around connecting, analysis services to serverless SQL. But look, essentially, you know, serverless SQL exposes a SQL endpoint. So software that connects to a SQL database can also connect to serverless SQL. You know, you can also create stored procedures within a serverless SQL database, because essentially a serverless SQL database is metadata. It's holding information external table syntax, views, store procedures, and you can call. So if you then find that you've got some repeatable SQL processes, you can create store procedures. And then if you want to trigger those store procedures, you can use the pipelines functionality within Synapse to chain those activities together.
Good. Any other questions, or anybody else want to jump in? It looks like some people may. So I guess there's, in that blog post, and Andy, just to double check, I guess there's probably a lot more explanation into the different steps that you went through. Obviously, and the queries will be there and everything else.
Yes. There's yes. I see. Melissa has said, have external tables, are they any less fussy recently? I.e., if a structure change has occurred. Well, yeah. This obviously feeds back into the Delta format, which has support for schema evolution, and at the moment the files do need to be in the same format. But Melissa, that's a good point. I haven't tested whether if you are selecting, let's say I have some Parquet files and I'm selecting specific columns from the Parquet files, if those columns moved, new columns were added to that Parquet file, would it still work? So that's a takeaway. And Johannes has asked a very good question. Do you have any SQL serverless implementation already in production? No, is the short answer. But if any company would like to hire me to implement it, I'm quite happy to do so from May the 1st.
All right, cool. It's very good. So I think everybody enjoyed that. I'm not sure, Catherine, if you wanted to do another poly or a survey or anything else.
No. There was only 2, so.
Okay, that's enough for poly. Fair enough.
Next time, next power break again.
Yeah. Okay.
And yes, thanks, Andy. It was great, and I enjoyed it too. So, thank you here.
Thank you for hosting.
Yeah. So, and I guess with this, we wish you a very pleasant evening. You're in London, so evening, and to all the others, a nice day or night or morning. Good. So definitely. We will see us next time.
Yes. Thank you very much. And we should probably plug Power BI Days as well, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we will do. On the weekend, Gavin, we will do.
Okay. All right. I just thought we had a captive audience here, but never mind. Okay, excellent. Yes. Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks again, Andy, for a great presentation. And there's a lot more information in Andy's blog post there, so if anyone wants to further reading, it'll all be there to have a look at.
Yeah. So bye.
Thanks everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thanks everyone. Bye. Have a good evening and have a good week.
Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.